Welcome back to part 5 of Domestic Decoration to Art in Daily Life and Death. So our last common context for plebeian art that I'm going to talk about today is tombs. Um, in the Roman period, tombs were usually located just outside of the city boundary. Legally, usually people were required to be buried outside of the city proper. And so these tombs would end up lining the roads on the way into the city. Here you can see a stretch of tombs leading up to a gate to the city of Pompeii. And so they would line the road, and all traffic that would be coming into the city from all directions would meet with these tombs on their way into town. Um, so this may seem like a very prominent place to sort of put your dead at this time period, but these tombs were also really active places and interactive places. So they remained continually in use by household members, as in may have an ancestral tomb that your descendants could also be buried in as well, or your extended household could be buried in as well. For some people, tombs were actually done by a sort of guild, right, like a collegium of people who would get together and pay for a tomb plot and have that maintained over time. So it doesn't necessarily have to be your household, it could be a different sort of association of people. And then these tombs would be continually maintained, ideally, by their household and by the descendants of the deceased and the family members of the deceased, and even the site for some of the annual festivals of the Roman calendar, like the Parentalia festival. You might visit these tombs to continue growing a garden patch that would be associated with the burial plot. And oftentimes the tombs would actually have a sort of call for engagement from passersby. They would call out actively, saying, remember me. I am Marcus Venutius Plancus, and I lived 64 days and 94 years, and here I am. You will be me someday. So things like that, these sort of formulas that would call out to passersby and ask for their attention and continued remembrance of the person buried there. In some cases, tombs might even take the shape of a bench or a seated area and invite you to take a seat as a passerby and take some time to remember the person who was buried there. So they are really active and interactive places, not set aside from the fabric of urban life in the city, but very much integrated into the process of moving between different urban areas. Anytime that you had to leave the city, you would be confronted with these spaces. So I want to briefly introduce a couple of specific tombs and discuss their iconography and their relationship to this style of plebeian art. The first shows up just outside of Porta Maggiore in the city of Rome. This monument that you see in this picture is actually a little bit later than the tomb itself. But it's interesting nonetheless in sort of showing this boundary between the urban space and the extra urban space. So this wall that we see here is the path of two aqueducts that brought water to the city of Rome. And then this gate was added by Emperor Claudius in 52 CE to sort of monumentalize these aqueducts, one of which he was responsible for building, the Aqua Claudia, and then also to provide a monumental gate leading out from the city urban center to the Via Praenesttina towards the east. So we have this tomb that is situated just outside the gate, and the gate is sort of built in relation so it doesn't overlap too much with the tomb. But it would end up, although the tomb is somewhat older, in a very prominent position in terms of traffic. So here we'll take a closer look at this building. It's a little bit of an odd shape. So this is the tomb of Marcus Virgilius Eurysaces. It was built sometime in the late 1st century BC, so right about a half century before this gate was built behind it. And the man Marcus Virgilius Eurysaces, who this tomb commemorates, is thought to have been possibly a freedman, a libertus, and that is on the basis of the construction of his name, which is some Roman first name, Roman second name, and then a Greek last name, following a formula that is often given to freed slaves, where they would take the names of their former dominus and then add on their own name as a sort of cognomen at the end. So no matter whether he was a freedman or not, Marcus Virgilius Eurysakes here was certainly a successful businessman, and he decided to use his tomb as a way to sort of express some aspects of his business and his commercial activity visually. So one way that we see this is in the actual shape of the tomb itself, with these strange round opening niches that a lot of scholars think are there to represent either grinding stones or ovens or bushels or some part of the bread making process, because he was a baker. And we know about his involvement in bread making through the frieze that we can see here up on the top, which is in a very nice plebeian example of the plebeian style. And here's just zooming in on a little piece of that frieze. You can see here a mule pulling or using a mule to turn the grain grinding vessel here, with a worker leaning in, perhaps adding more grain to this. We have figures kneading bread at these funky little tables, where the perspective is not really, it's sort of both front on and in 3/4 view simultaneously, so we get that mixed perspective showing up. Again, we have this emphasis on multiple activities, multiple phases in activity towards the creation of the product that Eurysakes was responsible for. And also with the number of figures here who are working, we get a sense of a really large scale operation. So this isn't just your hometown mom and pop local bakery. This is like industrial baking on a massive scale. Very fitting for this large tomb structure that Eurysakes has built for himself. So a really interesting example here of the way that someone's commercial life, the work that they did in life, is the thing that they most want to represent on the tomb after death, to show social status, to show status as a businessman, maybe playing a little bit into that wealthy freedman type in its sort of strange artistic idiom. It doesn't look like a lot of other tombs from the time period, but also really a sort of an impressive monument for somebody to have created to themselves. So if we look at a different tomb, once again involved in business, and once again with people who may not be sort of socially elite, but were monetarily elite by the time that they built these tombs, we have the Tomb of the Hetaerii in Rome. And this is a site that we don't have a good sense of the actual layout of the tomb itself, because the reliefs from within had been removed sort of piecemeal, mostly to the Vatican museums. So here are two busts that we have of our Hetaerii. We have Quintus Haterius here, presumably the patron of this tomb, and then we have a wife. We don't know her name, but she seems to have been the actual sort of subject of the tomb, the person that it shows up most frequently in the reliefs that we will be looking at that this tomb is dedicated for. So if we look briefly at some of the reliefs that have been removed from the Tomb of the Hetaerii, just like we saw with Eurysakes the baker, once again we have a really a strong representation of the family business, or what seems to be the family business. So let's begin with this. This relief right here is sort of a great example of the plebeian style in its intense narrative density. So we have over here what look like two slaves done in the plebeian style with giant heads and squat little bodies. They are operating a sort of pulley or crane system, which is being used to construct this lavish temple-like structure, which is actually a tomb. Over here, and we know this is a tomb because we have not the image of a goddess, but the image of the deceased woman in the pediment here. We have these other ancestor busts around the side, so sort of relating other family members. And then on top of the roof line, we have this scene in which we see the deceased woman, or presumably the deceased woman, sitting up actually with her children playing at her feet, so still very much alive in this setting. So we have a living image and a deceased image on the tomb itself. We have ongoing construction. We have a life pre-construction. We have the construction itself of a tomb, all represented simultaneously and in sort of lavish detail, actually, in this case, very sort of, if you zoom in on these images, you'll see that there's a whole level of detail sort of down to the smallest minute. We have slaves, for example, down here inside the wheel, turning the wheel of the pulley, that you can see that are extremely tiny because they are unimportant individuals. Another relief that we see from this tomb shows the deceased woman lying in state. So we just saw her alive in one relief, and now we see her deceased lying on the couch here, being mourned by the children, presumably the grown-up versions of the children we saw playing underneath her couch in the living scene. We have instruments being played over here by mourners. And then this scene down here is often interpreted as a scene that shows recently freed slaves of the household. So by showing that this woman who's deceased actually perhaps freed slaves either in her will or before her death, it shows her generosity, her magnanimity, in addition to her prowess as a member of this household that is presumably wealthy enough to create these monuments, and also as a sort of a mother figure, right? So taking care of the children, being associated with the family as well. If we look at one more set of reliefs from this tomb, here we just have a series of public buildings, some of which are quite recognizable. This one helpfully tells us it is the Arch to Isis, so the monumental entrance to a temple of Isis in the city of Rome. Here we have a representation, pretty schematic, of the Colosseum itself, with some little gladiatorial figures and statuary underneath the arches that make out the outer facade. And then we have a triumphal arch with a chariot on top, yet another sort of larger triumphal arch, and then what looks like a temple building. And these three structures, the identifications of them are somewhat under debate. But the sort of overall impression that we get from this relief paired with the active construction of the first relief that we saw is this idea that the family business of construction here likely involved work on major imperial projects, so major public works going on in the city of Rome, big commissions that these people were involved in, and a huge sense of pride in doing that, right? So not only does the deceased merit a whole lot of attention in the reliefs of this tomb, but so does the results and the fruits of the work of the construction business run by the family as well. So one more quick example, you've seen this a lot as the sort of opening card to all these lectures. And this is another grave stele, so a relief from a tomb area. And here we have a blacksmith at work. We have someone operating a forge here, and then someone actively striking some metal against the anvil here. And then we have, again, this large representation of some of the necessary tools to the blacksmith job to actually getting the work done. So we have multiple stages of the creation and also the tools that are necessary for the creation of the product. And then at the very bottom here, we have this little formula that is left over that says et elque, which stands for et libertis libertabusque. So this monument, just from those few little letters, knowing what some of these abbreviations in Roman tombs mean, tells you that this monument was also set up for the freedmen of the person who set it up. So what I want you to do after thinking about all of these plebeian art contexts and how we see this style emerging in places that are sort of publicly oriented, like tombs and shops, and also in the parts of the house that are more often utilized by non-elites, by slaves and workers. I want you to see if you can think of a contemporary artistic idiom, like a medium, a style, a visual mode of communication that grows out of popular use rather than the institutions of the sort of powers that be in the world or the sphere of fine art, right? So what are some sort of unofficial art media that exist today? And I will see you in the next lecture.